Hi, good day everyone. This is Sir Jet and welcome once again to another episode of The Contemporary World. Today we will have part 4, the last installment of our series on political globalization. It has been a long lesson and today we will come to the conclusion of the story. Okay? So, let us see where we ended last time. We talked about the Cold War in our last episode in part 3. And the Cold War, do you still remember the Cold War? Why is it called cold? Because there is really no shooting between the communist superpowers and the democratic superpowers. It's just the third world that they were trying to make fight one another. And so we ended that episode with communism collapsing at the end of the Cold War. And the communist countries taking up democracy as their form of government. So today, we will see how the world looks like. The world in the post-Cold War era. So there's no more communism technically in these days. No more pure communist government. What has happened to Germany? It's now a united democratic country. Before, it's divided into two. We have a democratic Germany and a communist Germany, but now it's just one Germany and they are united. The other smaller countries in Europe has become democratic as well, just like Yugoslavia is now Serbia, Croatia, Montenegro, they are now democratic, and so are Hungary and the other Eastern European communist countries before. The USSR has disintegrated. Russia gave independence to the 14 Soviet republics under their care before, like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Lithuania, Ukraine, etc. And parliaments replaced the communist governments in those countries I've mentioned. Now, how about China? What happened to China? China has opened itself to the US capitalists. Okay, so before, China has a closed door policy. It doesn't want anything Western to enter its land. And so everything in China is controlled by the state. They are communist, pure communist. But now, China's allowed US companies to operate in their land, to build factories like Nike, Apple, McDonald's, and all the other US brands are now in China. And so almost everything now in the world is made in China, like fire extinguishers, cell phones, televisions, gadgets, everything made of plastic, made of metal. Everything now that you see are made in China. Factories in China abound and they manufacture and export to the rest of the world. And who owns those companies? Not necessarily Chinese people, but actually Westerners. Americans, Europeans, they own those factories in China. They invested in China. So, China cannot be said to be a pure communist country because in communism, in pure communism, everything is owned by the state and there is equal distribution of wealth. But in China, it's not happening because the companies are owned not by the state but by foreigners. And wealth is not equally partitioned because the rich companies, they are getting richer in their businesses in China. Not only China, has opened its doors to the Westerners, but also Vietnam. It's a former communist country. You remember how South Vietnam fell to the communists? Now, the Americans are back in Vietnam, but not as soldiers, but as investors, capitalists, businessmen. Not only Americans, but also people from other countries like Japan and British people, and having their businesses and factories in Vietnam. So, Vietnam is no longer a pure communist country, just like China. So, the communist government in those places are now very open to Western capitalists. So, what happened to Marx's idea? Well, it's not being applied anymore in those countries. So today, only two countries remain as pure communists. And what are these two countries? Cuba and North Korea. But, recently, the Cuban leader Fidel Castro, whom the Russians helped install, had a very long reign in Cuba, but he died because of old age. And his successor is open-minded to U.S. partnership, just like what China did, opening its doors to U.S. capitalists. And they are having preliminary talks or some discussion on how Cuba would open its doors to the Western capitalists. Also, the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un is having exploratory talks on the unification of Korea. Unification means North Korea and South Korea would be merging into one Korea, just like what Germany did. No more communist part, but everything would be democratic. And they say that North Korea is open to the idea of the unification of Korea. And who knows, it might happen in the very near future. So experts are claiming that sooner or later communism will be a thing of the past. And Marx's idea is one big failed experiment. They tried it, it blossomed for a while, maybe half a century, but now, keeping up with the times, it seems irrelevant because countries are now giving up the idea of pure communism. So, where is globalization in our story? We have seen that the world is breaking down the barriers, the walls that divided between the communist ideology and the democratic ideology. Countries that were former communists are no longer communists today. So that means the barrier was broken. The idea of democracy has infiltrated the communist world, and they have accepted or they have adopted, at least in part, if not totally, the idea of democracy. So the trend that we are seeing now is the world is becoming capitalistic and democratic. The communist model of the state owning everything and preventing capitalism to flourish is no longer happening, because the world is reverting back, or the communist world is reverting back to capitalism and democracy as a form of government. Capitalism as an economic system, and democracy as a political system. That is the trend. That's where the world is going, as we have observed. So, in 2001, since communism is almost dead, okay, and democracy is like the undisputed world ideology, okay, something happened. Okay, a new enemy of the democratic world arose, and a new war is now being waged. It's now the war on terror, It's no longer the Cold War, but a war versus terrorists. 2001, terrorist manned airplanes crashed themselves on these two towers in New York City, and that really infuriated America and the rest of the free world, and they hated the people responsible for that terror attack. And it was owned by Osama bin Laden, an Islamic extremist from Saudi Arabia who went into hiding. And now, in the contemporary times, as we can see, the first world has a new enemy, and it's called terrorism. Terrorism because it's because they are sowing terror in the hearts of innocent people, peace-loving people. They would be attacked, bombs would explode in public places, and the worst, an airplane crashing into New York City. And who are the groups responsible? So the Taliban, the Al-Qaeda, ISIS, these are identified by the US as terrorist groups, and they launch attacks on the first world countries. Okay, so most of these people or terrorist groups are based in the Middle East. Now, they are extremists. When we say extremists, they are on the extreme. So it doesn't necessarily mean that all Islamic people are terrorists. No. There are a lot more Islamic people who are peace-loving. When we say extremists, they're on the far end of the line. Only a few people in the Middle East are terrorists. Not all, but just a very few. And they are members of the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, ISIS. And the US, being so angry at what happened in New York in 2001, launched an all-out war on terror. And it called its allies, okay, like the Philippines and the Big Four, to also be one with them in hunting down terrorists. And they even invaded, the US invaded countries that they think are cuddling these extremist groups. So there was a report that Osama bin Laden was hiding in Afghanistan, and Afghanistan is cuddling bin Laden, so the US invaded Afghanistan. And so there's a war in Afghanistan. And then Iraq. Another enemy of the US is Saddam Hussein. Okay? The fascist leader in Iraq. Very much vocal against the US. And it is said that this guy, Saddam Hussein, is creating or raising up nuclear arms. And not only nuclear arms, but also chemical and biological weapons. And so America invaded Iraq. And so that's the system of the US. You know, if it feels that a country is doing something in line with the war on terror, or launching an attack or planning an attack against the US or against democracy, they would invade that country. They did it to Afghanistan, they did it to Iraq. And so we see many US soldiers entering those Islamic countries because they see those countries as threats to democracy. And after invading those countries, the US put up democratic governments to replace the Islamic extremist governments. They sponsor a democratic government in Afghanistan. They did the same in Iraq. So the Taliban government in Afghanistan was wiped out, and then the US put up a democratic government. Saddam Hussein's government was wiped out in Iraq, and the US put up a democratic government in its place. So what's happening now in the Islamic world? Democracy is invading those places. The Islamic governments that used to exist are now replaced by democratic governments. So the question is this globalization? Those Islamic republics or Islamic governments, extremist Islamic governments, being replaced by democracy, is that globalization? Well, you can argue that maybe, probably, most likely, because what is globalization anyway? It is the breaking down of barriers. It is the world getting smaller. It is the world adopting a single idea. And what is that idea? Democracy. You see, those places once used to have a wall around them. They don't want anything Western or anything democratic idea to or product or anything connected to the US to enter their territory. But because of the US invasion, in the name of the war on terror, those places have now democratic ideas and even democratic governments. So is that globalization? Is that breaking down of barriers? Is that adopting a single idea, making the world a smaller place? Probably, most likely. Globalization is happening also in the Middle East. So democracy seems to be growing. It has toppled communism and now terrorism. So what is the role of the United Nations? If we see that the United States seems to be a world policeman or like the champion of democracy, spreading the idea all over the world. Well, the United Nations today, they still exist, yes. Started in 1945, and it has even grew bigger in terms of membership and scope of power. Because now the United Nations, as mentioned in the previous lesson, is not only concerned about peacekeeping, but environmentalism, food security, even the health issues like the war versus COVID. The United Nations is at the forefront, specifically the group called the WHO, or the World Health Organization. Now, the United Nations recognizes and respects the sovereignty of states. That means the United Nations does not really infiltrate or dictate upon the states what to do, because they recognize that the state must be independent. So they just give recommendations, or they try to solve problems or disputes the diplomatic way. Okay? So they arbitrate conflicts between member states diplomatically. Okay, you want to file a protest? Okay, file a protest, but don't make war. That's what the United Nations do. And then they listen to the sides, and then they make decisions. Just like what happened recently in our conflict with China, there was an arbitration case that we won. And the United Nations ruled that the South China Sea, the Spratly Islands, we have the right, okay, to have sovereignty over the islands that we are claiming. And China has no right to claim the islands that we are claiming, the Spratly, especially the ones very, very near Palawan. But here's the problem. The implementation of the United Nations rulings is up to the states involved. the United Nations will not really stamp it out and say, China, move out, whether you like it or not, or else we'll do something very harsh and we will prevent you from entering the South China Sea. No, the United Nations would not do that. So the implementation is up to us and China, whether we will agree or make some ways on how to solve our own problem. But as for the United Nations, they say this is our ruling, this is our decision, Philippines wins that case. You want to claim it, then go ahead and claim it. But China, sad to say, is not recognizing the decision of the United Nations. So the United Nations is like offhands, okay, to conflicts like that. And the most that the United Nations does is to send people like peacekeeping forces in hotspots. Okay, peacekeeping, not combat troops. They are not there to drive away one invading country or be on one side. They will not take sides in any armed conflict, but they are just there to keep the peace. Okay, so that's what they did in many places. And also, the United Nations send funds, send people to aid in calamities, but not really to take sides in political conflicts. Okay, so that is the world scenario today. As you can see, we are living in general peacetime. There's no big world war happening right now, although there are some places where there are tension politically. But so far so good, thank God there's no big war happening, there's no big world war happening in our time. So let us now have the synthesis of everything. Lesson 1, 2, 3, 4. What have we seen so far? We have seen a trend happening, okay, from the beginning to the present. We have seen that the world started with simple nomadic groups that are walking on the face of the earth. That's in lesson 1. And they polarized into settlements, formed nations, kingdoms, empires, mega empires. And these empires had borders separating them. Okay, the borders may be physical walls, physical borderlines. And later on we have seen ideologies. Like one empire or one group of country believes in communism and the other group believes in democracy, and there's a big wall dividing those two groups. Despotic leaders divided the world. Wars, economic systems, capitalism, communism, even religion and the likes. But now, in the contemporary world, the barriers are crumbling down. We have seen how communism crumbled in the 1990s and how terrorism is being extinguished by the United States and replacing those places with democracy. So what is happening in the world right now? Globalization. The breaking down of barriers. The unification of the world. It's all happening before our very eyes. And that is the story of our big lesson called political globalization. We have seen in the past 3 meetings, and this is the 4th meeting, the story of how the world globalized in the field of politics. The trend right now is the world is getting democratic. Well, we don't know what will happen next because we are not yet in that part of world history. But as of now, we have seen the trend. So, this is Sir Jet saying goodbye and thank you. And keep safe. God bless us all.